code password for I.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be starting in about 5 minutes. I'd like to encourage you to sit in the front middle section so that our speakers can see who they're talking to. Thank you. Please cuddle up in the front. Good afternoon, arriving guests. We'd like to encourage you to move down to the front and center of the room so the speakers can see you to talk to you. Thank you. We'll start in just a few minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please find your seats. We are starting our program now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch and are settled and cozy in your seats and ready for Plenary 5, Ending Dark Markets, Criminal Networks, and Cross-Border Crimes. My name is Yolande Aguimo, your MC, and leading the session is Moderator Gretta Fenner, Managing Director of the Basel Institute. Let's give her a warm welcome.
A very, very good afternoon to all of you, and if I have this strange look on my face, it's because the light is quite strong up here. It's absolutely wonderful to see so many having made the way to this faraway corner of the conference, and despite probably having been caught up in lunch and in very interesting discussions, and that's how I spent the last 3 days, and I have to say I'm absolutely delighted to be here and have you all with me. The title of our session is a pretty dark title, so let's see what we make with these dark times. But I have a fabulous panel who will help us unpack some of the big words that are in the title. They do all have lives that could individually fill books or multiple books, so I will have to keep my introduction of them very, very short. But nonetheless, a couple of words, and in no particular order. We have Paul Radu with us. Paul, wave your hand. Paul's the director and co-founder of the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, has also invented numerous other really fascinating things like the investigative dashboard concept of visual investigative scenarios and all sorts of technology-related stuff that I don't sometimes even know how to spell. I think he's obviously very well known to everyone here, specialized in exposing organized crime and corruption through a large journalistic international consortium, and that's certainly going to be one of the topics today. We have at the far end Anastasia Lapatina, who is a young Ukrainian journalist. She's worked for a newspaper called Kiev Independent, or a newsroom, I should rather say that, and she focuses very much on sort of human stories around human rights and life under occupation. Sadly, as we know, the occupation is anything but a lesser problem today. And she also is the co-host of a very fascinating podcast called Power Lines that looks at the effect of Russia's war in Ukraine on global geopolitics. Frederick Obermeier, where are you? Far right, is a journalist from Germany. He's works at the moment, amongst other, for Der Spiegel, has previously worked for the Süddeutsche Zeitung, is the co-founder of the Anti-Corruption Data Collective, something very, very fascinating and important, and of course, very well known for his involvement in the Panama Papers, the Bahamas Leaks, the Paradise Papers, etc., etc. In pretty much the middle, an old friend, Akere Muna, who's the founder and former president of Transparency International in Cameroon. He's a lawyer by training, has one of the oldest law firms in Cameroon, was running for president at some point as well, and sadly couldn't quite win on your anti-corruption ticket, but that hasn't made your commitment to the fight against corruption any lesser, I believe. And Akere is a well-known person here at the International Anti-Corruption Council conference because he was on the IACC Council for many years and was the vice chair of Transparency. Cecilia Müller, where are you? Here in the middle. Cecilia is the CEO of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, a absolutely fantastic industry-led collective action initiative tackling, corruption in the maritime industry, as the title says. And what's very interesting in her is also that she has worked as a compliance officer in the shipping industry for many years, so she surely knows what she is talking about. And last but not least, Raymond Baker, who I don't even know how to start introducing you because your life is very rich. So I'll keep it short, but Raymond is very well known, of course, as the founding president of an organization that's made tremendous contributions to the fight against illicit financial flows called the Global Financial Integrity, which he founded in 2006. And he, I would say, has probably spent the longest time of most of us in here, multiple decades, researching advocating and writing about illicit financial flows. So I'm going to go sit down now because we have a bit of a fireside chat. Unfortunately, the fireplace is missing, but we'll just have a conversation in a couple of rounds of connected questions, and then we'll open to the floor. If you have an absolutely urgent need to ask a question in between, raise your hand. I may see you, I may not see you, especially if you're sitting far behind, but we'll try to see if we can integrate it, but there will certainly be time at the end. So Gretta, I'm going to start with you. We heard the title of the event, which is really dark, dark markets, criminal networks, cross-border crime. And I remember previous IACCs, we talked about youth engagement, society, sort of forward-looking, positive, encouraging themes. So why are we in this dark age now? Is that just a random choice, which I of course don't think so, but how do you read this change in language in terms of how we talk today about corruption?
Well, maybe the first part was a commercial, but I don't know. But seriously, I think when TI started, it was just trying to put the debate on the table. And don't forget, in the 90s, the Germans could deduct bribery money, the banks couldn't talk about corruption. Actually, yesterday I was talking to Frank Vogel. Frank is right there. And he told me that it just started. He's one of the founders of TI and very first vice chair. And he told me that somebody, after Abacha left power, and somebody came to their office with a whole pile of names of people who had taken money. And Frank said, well, I don't know what to do with this. So then we had to put the subject on the table. So I suppose then that was the approach you're talking about. And through the years, when you fight corruption, it fights back. And so the approach has become very, very robust. And so through the years, even in TI, when we of the African chapters used to talk about asset recovery, and we had a meeting in Zimbabwe, nobody would talk about this. Now we have gone full circle, and we had a policy of not calling names. Mm-hmm. But now we have gone full circle. The World Bank talks about it. All of these multilateral banks talk about it. World Bank even has the stolen asset recovery, program, which stolen assets means the banks who keep the money are already handlers. So I think the evolution and the fact that people are beginning to see that many countries suffer because of this cancer, and you have to fight hard. Corruption mutates, and so the organization has to adjust, has to readjust with it. So many things are coming up. Raymond and I were on the illicit financial flow panel, and when you talk about illicit financial flows, you could see how evolved these things are. And you can imagine now we are up to the point of discussing escrow accounts. It was in our report. The UN is speaking about it. Tax reform. So I think that this mutation has caused, luckily for us, TI to really think differently. So I think that's what it is. You have to adjust, and that's what we've done, I think, through the years.
Yeah, as you said, the criminals are fighting back. Now we need to fight back again. It's a bit of a battle, right? Yes. I wonder, Paul, Akere was talking about these criminals that are fighting back. Who are these criminals today? I mean, my generation has still seen Godfather, which is maybe not anymore exactly the who we're facing with, though who knows? Like, what does a modern day criminal look like?
Well, thank you, Greta. And as some of you know, I love talking to criminals. I love talking about criminals. And I think in order to adjust, you gotta understand your enemy. You gotta understand your criminal. So I was pleased to not see many criminals on the hallways here. And really, crime is a mindset. But you mentioned the Italian mafias, and there's a line connecting the Italian mafias of the 70s, of the 80s, to the organized crime nowadays. It's rather not a line, but a highway, a very dark and very wide criminal highway. And we have not noticed this highway for a long, long time, although we are walking on it, and we are victims and victimized on it. Because what happened, and we've seen this, and we've looked at it at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project for the past 15 years, is that criminals built their infrastructure decades ago. And they're using actively that infrastructure right now. So you see these criminals coming from the 70s, from the 80s, and ossificating these corrupt systems that constitute right now a very solid base for future crime. So in all, what I'm seeing is two main tracks of crime. Two, if you want, parts of this highway. One is the solid ground, where the criminals walk and create on the basis of what's old, on the basis of old crime that generated a lot of income. These people who generated a lot of criminal income in the 70s and the 80s did not stop there. They've grown their criminal families, their criminal groups, and again, crime is a mindset. These people never stop. Crime is lifestyle. So what happened with many of these people is that they've become criminal angel investors. They've become investors in more crime. They bred more criminal groups, more crime. They literally, we've identified a few of these criminal angel investors who selected criminals that were very successful in their area, you know, sometimes drug traffickers, sometimes tobacco traffickers, human smugglers, you name it, and they would summon them, and they would offer them loans at a very high interest because crime is very lucrative, and this is something that we all have to acknowledge. So this is the first track that was built a long, long time ago, and what you have here on this track, on this part of the highway, is banks that are in the pockets of the criminals, law firms, many tech persons, technologists, hackers, you name it, is what we call the enablers, or at OCCRP mostly the criminal services industry. So we have all this layer of this criminal services industry serving these old-timers, let's say. And these old-timers bringing in new blood, new blood, new blood. But you also have a different track where crime is more ad hoc. These are the dark markets on the web, because criminals always operate across frontiers, and for many years they've operated across physical frontiers, from country to country, you know, they build their highway. But they're operating in the past decade over digital frontiers. They're operating across blockchains, across servers. They keep on doing what they're best at, creating criminal networks. And in the process, they realized that what they can do is they can create these Walmarts of crime, where you can actually buy ready-made crime packages that are offered, you know, to the world, to people with a criminal inclination to use like ransomware packages. You can go yourself on the dark web, you buy a package for such crime, and you use it for your own purpose to generate more money. So crime in itself has become a business. So there's the business of crime, but crime that has become huge business in the sense of selling criminal assets. The other thing is, and this goes back to the Italian mafias and to many other groups at that time, is the period of the Cold War, when many countries, especially in the Eastern Bloc, in the Soviet bloc, started weaponizing organized crime against the West. This again had a huge effect. You know, these governments, you know, in Moscow and in Bucharest and in Budapest and in Prague, you know, in all this Eastern Bloc, they were making a lot of money by using organized crime, including Italian organized crime. And then what happened was, because these governments weaponized organized crime, the organized crime weaponized the governments back. So now, the result of that is that you have governments that are almost completely in the pockets of large transnational criminal groups, and this is the hard fight to have with these people because, again, they have the infrastructure, they have the highway. The good thing is that we put a lot of lights on these highways, in the past 15 years through collaboration and all that, but they're always trying to take down those lights, to kill those lights.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes not quite clear who controls whom when you look at the criminal organized networks and the governments, because it seems to be kind of like a vicious circle of respective control. And, it almost feels like the Godfathers were a mild version and we would rather have them than what we have today. But let's move on and maybe take this even more into the present times, and moving over to Anastasia. From Ukraine, and you've worked as a journalist on various aspects of this, and I'd be interested in hearing from you a little bit how that compares, what Paul just said, how does it compare to what you saw in Ukraine, and perhaps on the one hand before the outbreak of the war, or before 2014, before February, and since February, have you seen a change in the form of organized crime in Ukraine?
Totally. I think what Paul said is hugely relevant to Ukraine, because when you spoke of the fact that crime is a mindset, I think that's directly related to how Ukrainians see corruption and crime and criminal networks in Ukraine, because I think a very specific and special aspect of the Ukrainian reality is, of course, the unfortunate neighbor that we have, that being Russia. And that's not me shifting the responsibility somehow of Ukrainian corruption to Russia, but it is absolutely true that so much of it is fueled by the Russian money, the Russian influence, and Russian intervention, both before 2014, be it via political installments, or in 2014 via an invasion, and then right now via a full-scale war. And I think this was one of the issues that took millions of people to the streets in 2014 when we had the Revolution of Dignity, because we really associated the poverty that we had as a result of this widespread corruption and criminal networks with Russia. We really saw Moscow as a face of this. It was almost as if corruption in Ukraine was this plague that came from Moscow, that came from the Soviet legacy of the Soviet dictatorship. You mentioned the 70s and the 80s, in our case it was the 90s. We really see this as something from which we have to orient ourselves away and orient westward. I think this association is really at the forefront of our thinking when we think about corruption. And then when Russia began its full-scale war, I think the conversation shifted slightly, even though journalists and our amazing civil society still covers the issues of corruption extensively, but we now have a whole different deal happening if we talk about cross-border crimes, because it is no longer about tax evasion and offshore accounts and money laundering, all hugely important issues, but in our case it's things like mass looting, and not only of civilian homes, but of dozens and dozens of Ukrainian museums. I mean, the government estimated that the loss that we have is in the tens of thousands of artifacts. The total worth is like hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's also important to recognize that this is not only happening for money, it's not only a lucrative deal, it's also highly ideological, right? Because we know that in the past, they would loot our museums solely for the purpose to display them in the Hermitage in Moscow. So I think the character of these crimes have changed a lot, because we also have human trafficking, we have thousands of children, many orphans, but also many just Ukrainian kids who have healthy families and parents that are alive, but they're smuggled to Russia, and some of them are given up for adoption to Russian families. I think these are the crimes that we're looking at right now, and it's fascinating that these activities are so highly organized. If we talk about mass looting of civilian homes, for example, it's not a one or two or a dozen or 100 Russian soldiers doing it. It really looks like this huge criminal enterprise where they have trucks that are taking these things to Belarus. They have specific markets where they're selling them. The Russian army is really emerging as this huge criminal enterprise for many reasons, but one of them is that they don't only kill and destroy everything on its way, but also steal for money or for something else. So I think these are the crimes that amount to genocide, and I think they also really need to be a part of this conversation, because in Ukraine it's not just about corruption in the financial industry per se, but it is also directly related to our lives and our history and our historical memory and so on.
Thank you very much. I think that's actually a really unique insight we just got from you, and a form of or cross-border crime that we need to, I wonder how much more easy it was for that kind of crime to start fast, because there were already the existing trading routes, the existing organizations, and so on. So when we talk about stopping cross-border crime and criminal networks, if they hadn't been there, I think that kind of crime would also not have been as quickly established at such scale. Cross-border crime, Cecilia, brings me over to you. The maritime industry and the transport industry in general, of course, crosses borders all the time. It's part of almost daily business, and as part of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, you have, I am sure, unique insight into that, and having worked in the shipping industry. So how big is that problem in terms of, how big is crime through the shipping industry or the maritime industry, and what is anti-corruption, or what's the part of anti-corruption in this, or corruption in this?
No, thank you so much. So I'm going to bring two experiences here to the table. In my previous life before leading MACN, I was working quite a lot with commodity governance in a large shipping company, so illegal cargo, not sanctioned cargo, but really what's in the container type of aspect. So I'm trying to bring both of these experiences to the table. And those who may not be familiar with shipping, in itself is a very positive story. I mean, 90% of all the cargo is transported by sea, right? So we are heavily dependent on the maritime industry for our daily lives, right? I think you can also equivalent, we have about 4 million port calls happening on an annual basis. So every day, 24/7, you have vessels going in and out of all parts of the world. To put that in perspective, if you're looking at some of the major ports in Europe, less than 1% of containers are checked. So you can just put that in perspective for cross-border crime, illicit flows of different type, and that is only the container trade in itself. So we are not looking at the tanker and anything else. I don't want to bore you with all the different types of shipping. I can spend half hour on that. So I think that's just perspective of the world we're living in. I would also like to share the perspective that shipping is highly regulated. I think we are one of the industries that have a lot of laws to cover, both from environmental to safety to operations. So very regulated industry, operating in very remote areas of the world. If you're looking at ports, they're often a bit outside, and the people who do operate the vessels are far away from their safety net, from their headquarters, from their support. So I think that in combination with time is money, getting vessels in and out of port is something that the private sector is very, that's part of the DNA, that you want to do cargo operations fast, in combination with public officials that need to inspect the vessels, that then also, of course, know that you want the cargo to go out quickly. So in that sense, you actually create incentives on both sides, because you have government officials demanding, and at the same time you have maybe captains who are then incentivized to get the cargo or the vessel out fast. So of course, in that relationship between humans, you do see a push for illegal payments on both sides. So I think on the operational impact of cross-border challenges, one of the perspectives that I think is often forgotten is that, of course, there are illicit flows of anything from illegal logs to drugs, but one easy stakeholder group to target is, of course, the captains. And that is something I think we've seen the past few years, that it's very easy to arrest the captain and blame everything on the captain. So you actually instead of maybe going to the root, I was just referring to your comment just on networks, it's easy to kind of, you nail the captain, and that is actually the part of the solution. Which, of course, the private sector and the industry doesn't agree with that. And in many times, these type of crimes have become a safety issue for the industry. Do we dare to send captains into certain countries where drug trafficking is a big issue? It is impossible to check a whole vessel. There are not enough guards, there are not enough enforcement agencies who can really secure that there's no drugs ending up on, if we put drugs as an example. At the same time, many of these jurisdictions are also very fragile in terms of, on what grounds can you actually arrest someone, how long can you put the person into that arrest, confiscation of passports, etc. So for the industry, these cross-border crimes, if you're looking at illicit cargo flow, has become a huge safety concern. So, and if you're adding that, of course, that tackling corruption in this industry is very complex. We're dealing with a lot of different stakeholders: cargo owners, ship owners, port agents, everybody who is part of the whole, maritime value chain. And that's why I think the whole improvement of port governance and port efficiency is so important, not just because what we do in tackling corruption, but also to mitigate some of the other risks that we see, if it's human trafficking, drugs, etc. And Gretta, as you know, I'm a huge advocate for collective action, and that's why I also think there's definitely room and space for more collective action, also for targeting some illegal activities, right, between enforcement agencies, between companies, etc., to really nail and not going for the easy victims or the easy arrest, so to speak, in the captain. So that was just some perspectives on the trade agenda.
We will come back to collective action, I think, and not only in that industry, but I think there's other collective actions on this panel as well. So it's a good transition. Over to you, Frederick, because you were instrumental in the publication of the Panama Papers, but frankly, it was a big collective effort, I think, of many, and certainly the Panama Papers were sort of what revealed many of the points we just discussed. So if you can just, in 2 minutes, remind us, what were some of the key things that we saw through the Panama Papers that before we may have suspected, but we really didn't have the proof for it?
Well, in one sentence even, the Panama Papers showed us how the rich and the powerful are hiding their money with the help of banks, law firms, and financial service providers. And if you allow me more than one sentence, it showed and proved us what many of us already suspected. That there's financial service providers who are offering services and are providing nominee directors, who are providing personnel who's pretending to be the ultimate beneficial owner of certain companies, and thereby is making, for example, investigations by law enforcement by far more difficult. That was suspected, but that was proof. So we were able, with the help of a whistleblower who gave us more than 2.6 terabyte of data of a Panamanian law firm, we were able to basically look into the machine room of this criminal networks and the criminal industry.
So you looked deeply into the highway that Paul was talking about. What happened after the publication of the Panama Papers? You didn't publish them because you wanted to become a world-famous journalist. You published them because you were hoping to evoke some kind of reaction. Are you happy with what you've seen in terms of how the world reacted to the publication?
Well, I must admit, I stopped judging my own work from the impact. It's sometimes hard because sometimes there's very important stories and there's no impact at all, and still I'm convinced that it's good stories and important stories. But I think what the Panama Papers reached was first of all, it was hundreds of investigations all around the world. It was so far around about $2 billion being recouped all around the world. That's a whole lot of money. It's like politicians having to step back, what means civil society holding politicians accountable. And first and foremost, I think that is even more important than the money, the investigations, laws that have been changed in many countries. We're discussing corruption, money laundering, shell companies, not only in expert circles anymore like this. Hey, at this conference, you did not need the Panama Papers. You talked about it anyway. But now there's films. There's an amazing Steven Soderbergh film about shell companies, about corruption. it is like John Oliver speaking about it. And I think that's important because we have to take these topics out of those like expert circles. As much as I love this conference, but this is not enough. We have to speak about it like on the street, on Main Street. We have to speak about it like with, for example, children. Let's discuss in children's news what corruption is and what harm it does even to children.
If your work is mentioned in a late night show, I think that's actual real impact because it gets indeed heard by many other people. So I think that is, you can tick that box of impact and success. Raymond, you've been at this for long, and apologies if I keep referring to that, but that's an incredible value for this panel. Your organization, all the organizations represented here, we've worked so tirelessly, and then we had these revelations and so on, and yet, are we seeing it's getting worse or more difficult to fight this phenomenon or corruption? Like, what have we done something wrong, or are we on the right path, but we need to do more? What would be your assessment on this?
Thank you, Greta. TI is coming up on its 30th anniversary. Coming up on its 30th anniversary next year. The fight against corruption, I think, has made great strides. Peter Eigen and Huguette Labelle can be extremely proud of what's been accomplished. Corruption has been curtailed in many countries. Having said this, the cross-border flow of corrupt, criminal, and commercial dirty money may be at the highest levels ever, particularly what is gushing out of China and Russia. We may be seeing the greatest movements of dirty money that the world has ever seen. How is this possible? It's possible because we in the wealthier countries provide the means for receiving illicit financial flows through our banking systems, as aided by our lawyers and accountants and real estate agents and other enablers, as Frank Vogel has written about so articulately. But now, to your question, what are we missing? What are we doing wrong? I would point out two significant elements in our failures. First, in many situations, we are misdirecting our efforts. My favorite organization in Washington to criticize is the Drug Enforcement Administration. It's created in 1973. It's coming up on its 50th anniversary. Across this half-century, DEA has never curtailed the flow of drugs into the United States or raised the price of drugs coming into the United States. Minor blips along the way, but nothing sustained and nothing substantial. Let me be clear, I'm not faulting the brave men and women who fight this problem in order to protect us. I am critical of the mandate that they are given and the management of DEA. DEA devotes about 90% of its efforts to curtailing the supply of drugs. This was a figure given to us by a former agent and confirmed by others, and he explained quite simply that it's more fun to go after the bad guys. Now, let me ask you, how do you curtail the supply of something that is in endless supply? Drugs are in endless supply. You take it out at the end of the supply chain, more comes in at the beginning of the supply chain. Take it out at the end, more comes at the beginning, endlessly. So how do you effectively curtail the supply of something that is in endless supply? You change your focus. You focus on the money. We need to go after the money. We need to shift the focus of our failing efforts to curtail the supply by working to curtail the money. Has this ever worked in any other context? Yes, we have succeeded in pushing a great deal of terrorist financing out of the legitimate financial system. Not 100%, but a lot of success there. After 9/11, the United States designated 51 organs of the U.S. government to focus on terrorist financing. And we put a great deal of pressure on other countries and to work with us and to address this problem themselves. Some of these countries complained that we were heavy-handed in our efforts. Believe me, if I had been in the Treasury Department, I would have been heavy-handed too. It worked. We succeeded in driving most of terrorist financing out of the legitimate financial system. Terrorists, for the most part now, are scrambling to make money through extortion and kidnapping and theft and so forth. But very significantly, we have limited the amount of terrorist financing that is in the legitimate financial system. So the lesson is go after the money. Whether it's drugs or human trafficking or terrorist financing or what, go after the money. The second element in our collective shortcomings. We in the wealthier countries love to direct our wrath at those corrupt countries over there. We have collectively failed to focus adequate attention on our activities over here. For example, when U.S. banks see what looks like dirty money, they are required to file a suspicious activities report or a currency transaction report. Can you imagine how many reports are filed? On average, 80,000 a day. U.S. banks will find an excuse to take the dirty money if they can turn around and file a report. Years ago, the director of FinCEN, which is our financial intelligence agency, said to me that in his estimation, 99.9% of dirty money introduced for deposit into the United States gets into the banking system and into our economies. In other words, he said 99.9%. In other words, total failure is just a decimal point away. We are not succeeding in this by any stretch of the imagination. What I'm saying is we like to blame other countries and other miscreants when in fact much of this responsibility rests with us. In summary, my answer is we need to, one, focus on the money, and two, redirect much of our efforts to ourselves.
I think in a way you were explaining I think if we were to focus more on the money, that would turn us automatically to ourselves, and that is maybe the answer why we've known this for a long time, focusing on the money, but somehow with terrorism there was a great willingness to do that, and with other forms of crime there isn't. So, you know, how do we tackle that issue? How do we overcome that clear lack of willingness to do that? But while we're talking about this north-south story, Akere, and I have to remind everyone to be a bit more strict with your 3 to 5 minute time because we really want to talk to the audience. But Akere, you know, the Glencore scandal, I don't know if the gentleman from Glencore who's actually at the conference, which I thought was fantastic that he was here, is in the audience, but I hope he is. He's apparently part of the cleanup team, so it'd be very interesting possibly to hear from him later. But tell us in a couple of words what that Glencore scandal is, in, like, you know, what does it tell us? Or what has it revealed?
Well, I'm going to try to talk about this without being emotional, because it's such an amazing happening. And the thing is, when you talk about corporate delinquency in the global north, there's no name to it. Companies don't go into banks, they don't sign checks, but these guys, they release them and the company pays up. They don't have their property seized, nothing happens. Nothing happens. And now the global south is getting more and more robust. I mean, the other day in Malawi, a vice president was arrested. What's happening in South Africa? You know, we're getting there. But suddenly, the breaks we are feeling are coming from the global north. And that is exactly what Raymond was talking about. So Glencore, these guys from 2007 to 2018 put together a bribery scheme that went through many countries: Brazil, Venezuela, Ivory Coast, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, DRC. The guys just engaged in state capture, bribing the justice system, the tax system, and everything, everybody. And so it's amazing that, it's a good thing that the DOJ in America was able, because one of the former employees of Glencore came up to say what happened. So Glencore, that since 2018 was resisting, was forced to plead guilty in the States and in the UK. What is striking, though, is that they've paid huge fines, hundreds of millions of dollars to the American government, and they're paying, I think, 247 million pounds in the UK for violating their laws on foreign corruption. But the victims of this, those whose systems were deranged, spoiled, and shaken, don't get a dime. We don't get a dime. Worse still, and that's what really pains me, is the fact that if you look at the evidence given to the court, take Cameroon, that's my country. They bribed the two national oil companies. They said these are the companies that were bribed. So they know the individuals who were bribed, but they don't release the names. They don't release the names. Glencore, all the executives, they were all fired, forced to have compliance regulations. They went scot-free. So, in a funny kind of way, many countries, Congo and other, I mean, the countries putting pressure. I don't know if Bolaji is here from Nigeria. They steered Thierry Bolaboko from DRC. These are guys who were struggling just to get the names of these criminals. But why is it that, I mean, if you look at the statement by President Biden on corruption, but why is it that then just send to those countries the names of those guys who took the money? They're right there. They're still in power. Why don't you release the names? So if we could get that help, and as the British, this is the Glencore case in England is the first trial of the scale in corruption. And my hope, I don't know if Delia is here, my hope is that, Huguette is here, is that this conference makes a statement, a strong statement about this kind of corporate philandering in your face. From Cameroon, from Nigeria, the money went to Nigeria, collected in Nigeria, flown in cash in planes, and distributed in Cameroon. They had two counters paying money in cash. The one in England was closed in 2011, and the one in Switzerland closed in 2016, where they paid out cash in bribes. To solve a case in the court, in the DRC, they asked for what they call ammunition to make a case of 16 million disappear. I mean, this is incredible in our century that it's happening, and the DOJ has the names of these guys. So something must be done, and I hope that the IACC makes a statement about this.
I think this is incredibly, incredibly important what you're saying, because in a way it's a success and a positive story that Glencore and other cases like that are finally being tackled, and that we see action across multiple jurisdictions in a coordinated way. But the two things that really are flawed still, and which we talked about it also on Tuesday, I think, on a panel, is who is the victim of this foreign bribery? Well, it's not the country that's prosecuting. I mean, how can you as a prosecuting country benefit from the fact that your company has bribed abroad? Like, that's like double crazy, right? And then, of course, we always blame those corrupt countries down there, but then we don't help them actually put their corrupt public officials behind bars because we don't give them the name. It just makes zero sense. It does give me a good transition over to Cecilia again, because that very company, Glencore, My previous chairman and I went to him about 8-9 years ago in the canton of Zug to his office and said, you know, sir, with all due respect, but I think we think you have major problems. Money laundering and corruption are rampant in your company and in your field. And we're offering a suggestion which could be, through collective action, starting to raise the bars. He said, thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you very much, sir. We don't have a problem. Our company is squeaky clean. And also, we don't want to work with our competitors. So thanks for your visit. Please go home again. I hope and believe, Cecilia, that the world has improved a little bit. Companies are a bit more awake to what collective action can do, for example, to start cleaning up and improving the capacity of companies to actually be squeaky clean, as he used to say. How's that working for you?
I mean, I'm a strong believer in enforcement, but if you're looking at the way business conducted daily operations, the fear of prosecution is not necessarily what everybody wakes up to and fear, right? I think we have to work with so much more incentives to build a better private sector. When the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network started, we had 2 visions which were embedded into the way we operate, and that is peer pressure, and that is the value chain approach. And peer pressure really lies in exactly, Gretta, what you say, that bringing companies of the same business, of the same sector together is vital. Being able to have conversations on very specific things that happen in that industry puts a pressure on these companies to operate in an aligned way, right? And there's nothing more motivating than sitting next to your competitor who have managed to do really well in a high-risk market with good integrity, right? That is something you, as a compliance officer, you bring back to your company and say, you know what? Our competitors are, managed to solve this matter by doing X, Y, and Z. That is something that I think management listen to. So I'm all for the whole sector approach of collective action to find peers, find common denominators of how the private sector can work together. That, in combination with a value chain approach, which we have in MACN, which means we have customers, supply chain, local business partners, everybody's working together. It's so easy to point fingers at someone who's not in the room. I'll give you 10 seconds, very quick example. When we started, we only had ship owners in our network. So easy to blame a local port agents. They're working in collusion with the authorities. We don't know what they're doing. So obviously, you bring the port agents to the table. The port agents will say, we only do what our customers tell us to do. We have no influence. But once you have them together, they work as a team, right? That's how humans work. It's easy to point fingers, but it's very easy to get people to cooperate when they're in the same room. And then you bring the next level to the equation is also to bring, of course, governments to the table. And that is the true parts of collective action. You have to bring every stakeholder to the table in order to tackle a specific solution.
We've got the shipping companies, we've got the bad or the good Glencores, governments have been mentioned. We have 3 journalists here on the panel, and we haven't quite talked about what journalists we will. I mean, we've heard partly from you, Frederick, but I'd like to hear, Anastasia, a little bit more about, a story like Glencore. Often they are broken through, journalists reveal them, through, be it a Panama paper or just one of those very, very noisy, investigative, very annoying journalists, right? So what's life like as a journalist? You're a young journalist in a country which is a hotspot before the war of certainly corruption and oligarchic structure. Like, how do we have to imagine, how can you go about doing your work, and who are your enemies and who are your allies?
The other day I was having a dinner with somebody who spent decades working on Ukraine, and this person said something that I thought answers partially this question very well. And they said Ukraine is actually ruled bottom up, not top down, which may seem counterintuitive because we're not exactly the least corrupt and most democratic country in the world, unfortunately. But I think it is absolutely true, because the strength of our civil society and our journalists is so amazing that you really have to be blind to not notice that despite the fact that the government may be putting all sorts of hurdles in our way, we really do fight like hell against corruption and against organized crime and all of the terrible things we've discussed. And we've had many investigations in Ukraine that have been opened solely as a result of the investigations that have been done by my colleagues. And of course, now that we have a full-scale invasion, it's become more tricky because some of my colleagues have shifted from focusing on the corruption within the Ukrainian government to the crimes committed by the Russian military. Not to say that the first one is not important, of course. I can assure you the conversations within the civil society about the corruption within the government are happening all day long. It's not something that we brush off or ignore because we're in some sort of state of a war. These conversations are happening, but it is tricky because we have all of these considerations about the Western aid, about the public opinion. But I do want to use this opportunity actually to highlight the work of my colleagues at the Kyiv Independent. I think this is really important. Two of my colleagues, Anna Moronyuk and Alexander Khrebet, they just 2 weeks ago published an investigation about the alleged misappropriation of weapons within the Ukrainian International Legion, including some of the Western supplied weapons. Those were light weapons, like anti-tank, for example. And to the best of our knowledge, we were the first Ukrainian media that has done an investigation on this subject. And it was, of course, a very long and very dreadful work, and it was also extremely stressful because we had to consider what are the other Ukrainian outlets going to say, what is the West going to say, what is the public in Ukraine going to say, how it's going to be received. And we received a lot of really, really good reactions and a lot of support because people, in a way, in the West especially, were shocked that we would dare to, air the dirty laundry like that in a time like this. But we published an editorial to explain to our audience why what journalists do and why what we do is so important. And I think it perfectly answers your question too, so I want to quote it. So we said, in this war, Ukraine is fighting for its future. We also believe that airing these allegations gives Ukraine the chance for positive change. Because if officials address the issues we raise in this story, reform the International Legion and oust the bad actors, it will become stronger and more effective. It can lead to better conditions for the people serving in the Legion and even save their lives. And it is fighting for the right to live by the values of the free world, values that are antithetical to those ruling today's Russia. And freedom of speech is one of these values. So I think that perfectly summarizes the role that journalists have, especially in Ukraine.
Clap, exactly. And that goes to you, to all your colleagues, and to all the very courageous journalists around the world who have to work in comparably delicate situations where you have to balance, the interest of transparency and putting information out there, but you can never entirely forget what the consequences are, which doesn't mean you should shut up, but just think about it very, very carefully. I think, Paul, I can sense you want to come in and feel free to react in whatever way you want. But I also want to come back to that terminology of collective action, because we've seen companies are increasingly thinking about working together, and we've seen the enormous success of journalistic cooperation across borders. Is everyone that should be working in a collective action doing that already, and or which piece are we missing here?
Yeah, first of all, I believe the work Anastasia is doing with her colleagues is just amazing, and it's obviously in the direst of the environments right now. And they keep on investigating crime and corruption during a war. This is something, that for a journalist it takes a huge toll. And I know that many Ukrainian journalists, when the war started, when Russia invaded, had this huge problem inside of them saying, what are we doing here? Are we going to be able to investigate crime and corruption anymore? Should we all be on the side of the state and represent the interest of the state because the country is at war? But then, what they've done that was brilliant was to explain to the state that this work is of utmost importance, because only by keeping the focus on corruption, you'll have a cleaner environment where the Ukrainians can really fight back in a way that's meaningful. So thank you. One other thing that's related to this is criminals always think big, criminals always dream big. A guy like Putin dreams big. His plans are huge in his head. Now that he cannot implement them because of these pesky Ukrainians, that's a different thing. But we do need to understand these dreams. We do need to understand these plans. And that is crucial, I think, and I've seen in many of the panels here that people across sectors, activists, journalists, government people, are starting to see the value in these alliances, in cooperating, in exchanging method, in exchanging strategies, because criminals are really creative in what they do. They're always early tech adopters. They have a lot of money at their disposal. They have the best lawyers at their disposal. They can design amazing strategies that we can't really get near to because we don't have the same resources unless we connect with each other, unless we create these alliances. The other point is that these alliances need to be built on the back of transparency. It's my belief that if you unify all the property registries in the world, all the beneficial ownership registries in the world, the shipping registries, everything that you have as public data, you'll just by connecting these data sets between each other and doing cross searches and allowing the people to do the cross searches because the activists and journalists are not enough in numbers, I think that would lower the corruption in the world by at least 5%. And that would be just by connecting systems between them. So we do need this transparency. We do need the journalism, the activism. We do need the private companies to be part of this fight. We do need the law enforcement to actually forecast more of what the criminals are going to do next. Because we do need to kill their dreams, to shatter Putin's dream for the world that he's imagining. So, thank you.
You know, we clearly have a supportive audience, and what you just said is actually something that I'm not sure, I haven't really checked in with anyone else, but this conference, and I've attended many of these conferences, this is the conference where for the first time I feel this is an anti-corruption community. This is not the civil society fighting against corruption. There's a few people from the private sector, there's a bunch of government officials who dared to come and have incognito and kind of show their face. But I feel like everyone's just part of exactly the same family. There are 2,000 people here representing many more thousand people who somehow there is no more difference. And I mean, I have that feeling, and I really want to thank TI for somehow bringing us together in a different, maybe it's just the movement that has changed, but I really feel that very strongly. And coming over to you, Frederick, again, you know, I'm an optimist. The world looks really dire. Being an optimist, I wish there was a world where we didn't need any Panama Papers anymore, you know, because we don't need leaks anymore, because we don't want leaks. I mean, if we could live without leaks, that would be fantastic. We would like to know the information without the need for someone to, you know, smuggle a USB stick out, breaking a whole range of laws and taking huge risks and handing it over to you. Will we ever get there? No, I get that.
So if you have some, so here I am. No, but seriously, in that regard, I'm like looking a little bit more pessimistic on this world. I think we will always need brave whistleblowers who do see wrongdoing and who dare to speak up, risking lawsuits, risking being thrown into prison, losing their income. So this is something that we will need and that we should appreciate, and therefore we should work on like better laws to protect whistleblowers. But I agree to a certain extent that we would be less reliable, or would have to rely less on leaks if there were more transparency out there. I mean, Paul ticked that box already. It's like, hey, real estate registry, company registry, when it comes to like container content registries, stuff like that, hey, that's something every government could do. And there we are again on like pointing fingers to other countries. It's always easy pointing your finger to your neighboring country, a country in the global south, not having such a registry in place. But let's clear up our backyard first. Let's clear it up. Hey, we're sitting here in DC. The Corporate Transparency Act was nice. You have a nice UBO register here in the US, but why the heck is it not open for civil society groups, for journalists? If we rely on law enforcement to fight corruption, to fight money laundering, well, then we will never win that fight. It is civil society groups, it is journalists, and it's like brave citizens who are like using their time to uncover those wrongdoings. So help them, and it's so easy.
Very, another excellent point. A lot of, and I want to kind of bring it to a kind of high-level-ish big picture with Raymond, and please get ready with your questions because we are so well on time that we will have time for lots of discussion. And I see the first one. Maybe we're not starting with the questions yet, but get ready. Wait a second, not yet, Tom. Raymond, I just want to ask you if you can connect what we've just talked about to the big issue of democracy, because, you know, we don't fight corruption for the sake of fighting corruption, but because it undermines democracy, it undermines peace, stability, equality, and all these essential ingredients, you know. How do you envisage something about reshaping our societies or economies? It's also a social issue, you know, like how do we reshape how we are shaped today as economies and societies to bring this democracy a little bit out of the grip of corruption again?
Democracy is indeed the ultimate question. I have been wanting to see faster growth for a long time in our anti-corruption efforts and progress. And so I've written a second book. My first book was published in 2005, Capitalism's Achilles Heel. I've written a second book called Invisible Trillions, How Financial Secrecy is Imperiling Capitalism and Democracy. And in this, I explain how capitalism has adopted a new motivation, secrecy. This did not exist when I graduated from business school in 1960, not nearly to the same extent. Secrecy is a new motivation that has embedded itself into the capitalist system. And in support of this new motivation, we have created a financial secrecy system that now handles perhaps half of global financial flows. This system, as known to many of you, comprises tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions and disguised corporations and anonymous trust accounts and fake foundations and hybrid entities that can appear to be a corporation in one place and the same thing appear as a charity in another place or a partnership in another place. And then we've created all sorts of money laundering techniques to handle specific activities. And finally, and this is key, we have left holes in the laws of our Western countries to facilitate the movement of money through this financial secrecy system and ultimately into our own economies. A major point that I make in my book, in my new book, is that every single element of the financial secrecy system has been created by us in the Western countries. Not a single element of the modern financial secrecy system has been created by drug dealers or corrupt government officials or terrorist financiers. No, every part of this has been created by us. Let me take this up a level. The original pillars of democracy, popular vote, rule of law, representative legislatures, protection of minority rights, though imperfectly implemented, have not fundamentally changed since they were created in the late 1700s. The original pillars of capitalism, making profits, spreading wealth, generating public goods, are now radically altered. Capitalism has taken on a new motivation over the last 5 or 6 decades, a motivation for secrecy that is as important as its motivation for profitability. capitalism and democracy should be operating in sync to spread prosperity and freedom. Instead, these two systems are becoming decoupled, no longer operating in sync. The effort to move forward with anti-corruption programs, anti-money laundering programs, the fight against drugs, trafficking, counterfeiting, arms, and so forth. In order to be successful in this, we now need to take a very fundamental look at the whole of the democratic capitalist system, and in particular, its capitalist component.
I'm curious if there's reactions to your statement, either here on the panel, about capitalism and democracy and how realistic it is that they will act in sync. But I just want to see, we had one gentleman here first, Frank, sorry. First, come first. And you're going to be next. Please, sir. And please, can you introduce yourself and keep it to a short question, and please, no statements, questions, please. Discussion contributions.
Yes, this is Ilgar Gachiyev. He had a multi-billion-dollar company in Azerbaijan and Russia, and he lost to Putin regime and to Aliyev regime, and he has a question, but he doesn't speak English, so I'm going to translate.
Спасибо, здравствуйте. Хочу поблагодарить сперва всех журналистов, которые борются с коррупцией.
I want to thank every one of you who's fighting corruption.
И хочу задать вопрос по Пандора документам, которые раскрыли преступления алиевской семьи. И что дальше, как смотрит на это мировое сообщество? Алиев дальше продолжает работать со всем мировым сообществом, и никто не занимается продолжением расследования этого дела.
And I have a question about Pandora documents that was released about Aliyev's regime. And my question is what exactly is done about it, because everybody knows about it and nothing is done because he is still in power.
Okay. Thank you.
Потому что напрямую бизнес, который мой забрали, на этих людях находится имущество в документах Пандоры, и я хочу знать судьбу и решение, что будет дальше, сообщество, как к этому относится, как люди получат свои активы обратно.
Okay. Because in these documents, Pandora, and I know these people who took my business away, they have a lot of assets in different countries, and nothing has been done about it, and I want to know how people are going to get their money back and what it's done about.
Okay. Thank you very much. We will come to your question. I'm just going to take a quick question from Frank, or are you a double act there? Or? Yeah, you are. Okay, cool. And then the lady here.
Sorry, I have a quick question. I just want to, first of all, this is a wonderful panel, and thank you all. My name is Frank Vogel. I want to underline what Akiri only said. Let's never forget there are victims for all these crimes. And TI started with a focus on poverty, and we shouldn't forget that. But my question, to Paul and to Frederick, who do incredible work, picking up on what Raymond said, isn't it time that you and others like you started investigating the authorities in Western countries for the failure by them to adequately investigate corporations in the way that they should? Last year saw the lowest level of enforcement of the OECD Convention in many years, according to a TI report. My question, is simply, last week, the NCA refused to name the name of the Russian they arrested for money laundering. Last week, the Swiss authorities fined a total of 4 million Swiss francs, no more, to ABB for its massive corruption in South Africa. Shouldn't you start investigating these agencies? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. So, the lady here. Oh, you, sorry, I didn't realize. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. My name is Anderson D. Merman. I'm from Liberia, and I work for the National Chapter of Transparency International Liberia. 3 quick questions. One, Liberia is said to have the second largest shipping registry in the world. It's estimated that up to 44,000 plus ships fly the flag of Liberia. My question to our colleague or the panelists that was speaking to the CSO coalition around maritime engagement. I'd like to know what you're doing to work with grassroots organizations in Liberia, countries like Liberia that has a very huge maritime program to have citizens oversight when it comes to the maritime sector, because there's not much happening in terms of civil society engagement around that. Then the second thing is, based on your experience, I know everything we're seeing here about corruption, the global framework and all of that, what's happening at the local level is extremely important. So there's a disconnect between policies and implementation. We have a lot of laws, especially in Liberia, but those laws are not being implemented. So based on your years of experience, what would you look at or recommend as the foremost option? Is it to deal with response or prosecution, or to go with prevention, awareness raising, and all of that? That's one. And then the last one is around what practical ways that development partners and organizations or international organizations can help countries to deal more concretely with corruption. I know the Global Magnitsky Act, the US government and other governments are implementing it, but in addition to that, what practical things that can happen to get governments, like my government in Liberia, that has very limited political way in dealing with corruption, to be more concrete in dealing with the situation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will come to you. Let's maybe take these questions first, so we have a bit of we still remember them well. Question about Azerbaijan. I was thinking maybe Paul or Frederick want to respond to that, and then also the investigation of the Western authorities.
On Azerbaijan, we've investigated Azerbaijan for many years, starting in about 2010. At great risk for our reporters in the country. Khadija Ismailova, our dear colleague, was jailed. She was put under physical surveillance in the country. Then she had Pegasus infecting her devices, her phone. So she was followed everywhere. She kept on reporting. She has reported on Paradise Papers, Panama Papers, the laundromat, the Azerbaijani laundromat, and I believe as a result of that, the territory and the access that the Aliyev regime had with Europe and the US has shrunk. Probably not enough, and there are all these, unfortunately, backroom deals, especially for the resources of Azerbaijan that are done, but I see that the Aliyev regime and the accomplices of the Aliyev regime cannot do business as they've done before. Now, I'm sorry you haven't recovered your money yet. I hope you do. What we do is we pinpoint to the crime, we pinpoint to where the money goes, and if you have some information for us, I'd be very happy to receive it and to continue investigating. Just if you allow me on the investigating the investigative agencies, investigating the investigators. We are focused on organized crime and corruption, and this usually is transnational business. Now, unfortunately, most law enforcement agencies are confined to national borders. So what we do is we investigate the crime itself, crimes that sometimes these agencies cannot investigate because they don't have the reach, or they don't have the will, or they are not allowed to. So we investigate where they don't investigate, and in the process, very often, we expose these agencies as well and their inefficiency.
Thank you very much. Frederick, you want to add to that, I think?
And if I may add, I mean, it is something that we speaking about investigative journalists at OCCRP, at ICAJ, at other groups are of course seeing. ICAJ even had a project called the FinCEN Files, looking at what is going wrong in exactly this country here. We also, like me speaking for Germany, we had a look at what is going wrong in Germany in this regard. So this is something that we have on our radar. We try to focus as much as possible on these structural problems. But I also want to this brings me back to a topic we already touched before. It's if we speak with investigators, with oversight organizations and authorities, they always point you out, especially when it comes to investigators, like, wow, it always takes so long. Everything is transnational. We need information from the Cayman Islands. It takes us so long, and then if we want something from Panama, we have to go up our ministry. Then on the ministry level, they are speaking with Panama. And it's like, but informally, all those investigators will tell you one thing. It's like, there's stuff that they know. They know ICAJ's homepage and what ICAJ has published and made public on their webpage, like the Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, structural information on the Pandora Papers. They know the investigative dashboard from OCCRP, and they know basically all public registers. Unfortunately, it's not that many out there, but those public registries, they also have help investigators, because they can use them as well, and they can get rid of this like bureaucratic way of like having to send and sign long letters, and unfortunately sometimes it's still letters and not emails, so that makes it even slower.
And recently we heard that there was a challenge when the paper was European size when it comes to the US and vice versa, which really made me, wonder, can I take my moderator's liberty here and just add one thing that I believe really is also in relation to what Frank said. We here, for whether it's sincere or not, but there is no leader in sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, increasingly now we look at Moldova and Bulgaria, who make anti-corruption their absolute core proposition. They talk about it 2 times a week in some sort of a public forum, domestically, internationally. From CEOs in companies, we say the tone from the top is all that determines it, right? I'm afraid I rarely, if ever, hear any of our Western European leaders, maybe at the exception of Joe Biden at the moment, make a public statement constantly and repeatedly about their commitment to fighting corruption, fighting financial crime, making sure their jurisdictions don't offer those loopholes. We expect that from leaders in the so-called corrupt countries, but we never hear it from our own leaders here. So the tone from the top, in my view, is missing. And that's why those investigators don't have the resources to do their work, and why they get frustrated when they have to go to the Cayman Islands. Apologies, I just needed to say that. Cecilia, do you want to respond to the shipping question on Liberia, please? Akere, I'll come to you in a second.
So thank you so much for the question. I think there were a lot of questions in there, so I think I will try to make like a crisp answer. Otherwise, Gretta will, I think, pinch me because it will take long. But just on a very practical level, as an organization is extremely important. Now we of course also have results, right? This is not like a global program. This is really going on the ground and working to find solutions that actually mitigate and eliminate corruption. I think that's the core of what we do. I think one of the successes we have a large program in Nigeria, for instance, looking at how we now can share that across West Africa. I don't know if I have my amazing partner Sochia Pampa here in the audience, but we really work in countries as well through civil society organizations or through amazing local lawyers who are really the heroes of what we do as well. But to answer your question in a quick way, I think that prosecution and investigations are extremely important. It's extremely important to have different perspectives. But one thing we often forget on successfully tackling corruption is that we also need to work with incentives. If you have the most corrupt official in front of you or the most corrupt industry leader, they will say corruption is bad. That's what everybody's saying today. We spent 30 years saying corruption is bad, but we have not yet have really results on using that argument in itself. So what MSN is trying to do, and again, coming back to the importance of sector-driven collective action, is that we can bring the trade aspects to the table. We can say, if you have corruption in this port, you will not meet the goals of the government to diversify trade or ease of doing business. So the reason why we have been successful in challenging jurisdictions is not because we stay focused on corruption. It's actually because we make it important for governments to come to the table because we align our work with the ambitions of that government. And I think that's the pure reason why governments are first interested working with us. Also because we have 180 companies behind us. So we have 50% of the world's market in shipping. So when we're coming and knocking on the doors of government, we directly incentivize them to come to the table because they will not reach their national goals unless they have this type of corruption in their ports, right? So we bring intelligence to the table. We also have an anonymous reporting mechanism so companies can report to us when they've been faced with corrupt demands. So again, when we're coming to the government, we are well prepared. We can also say that you have X amount of corrupt demands in these ports the past 6 months, for instance, right? So we're extremely concrete when we come to governments, and we request them to work with us because they need to. Not because corruption bad, everybody said, because they need to support their people. And that's our argument. And every private sector, every industry has their arguments, and just need to articulate that in a different way. So incentivizing why you should fight corruption, I think there's more work to be done that in really to get governments to the table to collaborate, right? I don't know, I'm happy to speak about other things, but that was just the overall agenda on how we can work on the ground and why we've been successful.
I'm going to pinch you now.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry.
I want to quickly connect that, and maybe I was wondering if Akira can come in on the related question, and then we are going to take 3 more questions, and we're going to run 5 minutes late because we started 5 minutes late. When the question about the disconnect between the big global norm and what's happening on the ground, and I think you just beautifully showed how you can't just go to country X and say, hey, this is the big international standard, now you do that. How are you experiencing that? Or what's your answer to that challenging question that we were posed by the colleague from Liberia?
I think what we're seeing in the world today is a leadership crisis. We have to admit it. There's a leadership crisis in the world. And in many of our countries, it's a leadership crisis. And where you don't have the leadership, you can't have the political will to give traction to the whole process. And that's what we're seeing. There is no African country, I'll talk speak for Africa, maybe in the world, that has elections without corruption being at the center of it. But afterwards, that's it. You know, and it's not only for Africa. If you look at the statement by the president of this country in 2021, is the most robust document against corruption that has been produced. I mean, the Americans have a position paper against corruption, which is really robust. And I think the Assistant Secretary of State did hint about it. So the thing is, once that happens, in Congo as well, the DRC, the president came out in 2019 with a robust statement. Then afterwards, politics happens. And by God, that's where civil society and journalists are important, to hold their feet to the fire. Because if you don't do that, you know, you'll be the next round. So somebody will come out and talk about drilling the swamps, or I don't know what. So that's what it is. It's the fact that, yes, you'll make the statement, but afterwards, what happens? Is elections the only means by which you can have people be accountable for what they say? And so I think that more and more, because of this gap between pronouncements and implementation, civil society and journalists are called upon to play a great role. And they need protection. And if you don't have that going with it, I mean, there's Professor Liwonga, who is here from Albany University, and he's been working very hard on whistleblower, because these are little accompanying measures that permit this to happen. So that's what it is. I think it's a problem of leadership and political will.
Yeah. We have 3 questions, 30 seconds each, 1 question here, and that's the end of the questions for today, I'm afraid, but go ahead.
Hi. First of all, Greta, thank you so much for this amazing plenary, and thank you, all of you. This has been really, really insightful. My name is Janina Segnini. I'm an investigative reporter, and for several years I've been investigating the maritime industry. So my question is for Cecilia. You talk about, and I'm really happy to hear that you're working at the port level and with the companies, private sector, and so on. But it's not a secret that the maritime industry is really, really corrupt. And yes, you say it's regulated. If you're talking about MARPOL, SOLAS, and you know, all these international agreements, yes, but at the highest levels, landlocked countries like Moldova, Bolivia, actually Bolivia, La Paz, at some point was the largest port in terms of ships registered in La Paz. And Moldova, the same thing. And those ships are the ones doing all the horrible things because 70% of our planet is composed by water and we don't see what's going on. So at the same time, yes, at the same time you have the three largest registries, Panama, Marshall Islands, and Liberia. There's no possible way to know who's the beneficial owner of the ship. So what are you doing at the highest level at the IMO to fight corruption in the maritime industry?
Thank you. Very quick, 30 seconds max.
Hi, my name is Richard Horowitz. I'm an attorney. My question is for Raymond. In the title of your book, you had the number trillions, which is a lot of money. So my question is, how did things get so bad? Is it that the compliance agencies are incompetent? Is Frank correct that they need to be investigated? Is it something inherent in the system, like you wrote in your 2005 book? Or what explains how bad things got?
Where did the zeros come from? Another question here, last one over there.
Ana Gomes from TI Portugal. Illustrating what Mr. Baker said, indeed, it's our own making, and sometimes by omission, but it's also deliberate. Last week, the European Public Prosecutor started an investigation on VAT, about over 2 billion, they think. It's in the so-called carousel fraud. Back in 2018, the Commissioner Moscovici had highlighted that this carousel fraud, which was deviating from EU coffers about 1/3 of the EU annual budget into all sorts of criminal organizations, mafioso, including Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, and was proposing the ministers of finance of the European Union to put some minor changes in the VAT law that would prevent the carousel fraud from going on. Till this day, nothing has been done. So it's our own making. And why doesn't such a glaring case deserve more commitment, namely on the part of the IACC? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is both a statement and an sort of an underlying question, and I'm going to give everyone maybe just at the end 30 seconds to reflect on some of these or other points. We have one more question, please.
Hi, yes. I'm Nicole from a counter-trafficking group called The Network. I have a question about messaging and audiences. Given that the audiences for a lot of the incredible reporting that these groups are doing, and you know, even traditional newspapers can be maybe considered to have a niche audience in a lot of places now, what is the panel's thought on the new frontier of reaching the broader public? Mechanisms, means, whatever it is, but what's the future of reaching a bigger swath of global populations? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And we're going to close the questions here. Thank God nobody's standing anymore. Good timing. So some of you were asked a direct question, but I'm just going to go down, starting with Frederick, maybe respond to questions that you wanted that came in now. My reading, in a way, is very, very simplified. We need to continue to squeeze the space of those people who want to operate illegally, badly, and all you guys are working on this. But there is also something in Cecilia where she said we need to find the right incentives to get those who have zero incentive to fight corruption to maybe do something in that direction. So I was curious on your thoughts, but also respond to any of the questions. Frederick, do you want to get going? Final words.
That's a huge task, and someone mentioned it today. It's a huge task for us as journalists as well, like always trying to focus also like on the victims. And we shall communicate more that corruption is not like an abstract crime, it's a crime that affects all of us. But it's a challenge, I must admit. It's always, whenever we write an article, it's always like hard to really nail down who the concrete victim is. I mean, we know that it's all of us, but who is it concretely? Because that's how audiences tick. It's like how readers tick. They want a person and not like any one of us. So that's a huge challenge that also brings me to the question like how to reach bigger audiences and other audiences? And that's a question that I guess many of us, Anastasia, Paul, I, are questioning ourselves like on a regular basis. Is it like new platforms? Is it new forms of storytelling, maybe theaters, comic books? I myself, as a father of a young child, ask myself like, how can we bring like corruption and money laundering into children's books? It's like, because that's their, it should be there. They should learn about it. I mean, there's so many police books. Children love police books. They love firefighters books, firewoman books. So it's like, hey, maybe that's a way of like communicating it. Bring us like, you know, like small children are so much into like those audio crime stories, but they're never about corruption. They're never about money laundering. It's always about guy one stealing something from another person. It's like, but that's corruption. It's also stealing from someone. So I think maybe that's a way of like how we should speak about more. But it's a challenge, and it's like there is journalism conferences. It's conference like this, where this is one topic after another on dozens of panels. But so far we have not found the ideal solution. But we are trying.
Where did the many zeros come from, and how can you add to Frederick's attempt to find a bigger audience?
Let me comment on Richard Horowitz's question and Frank Vogel's question. I've done a fair amount of economic investigative work in my career. There are three components of illicit money: corrupt, criminal, and commercial. I thought for a long time that the corrupt component was the biggest. I have learned through doing literally 1,000 interviews around the world, long interviews, that the commercial component is by far the biggest. Carrie and I have had the pleasure of working together for years on the high-level panel on illicit financial flows out of Africa. The best data that we have available indicates that Africa is a net creditor to the rest of the world. What that means is that instead of richer countries supporting Africa, Africa supports richer countries. I would respectfully submit this is not the kind of world that you want to see continue through the rest of the 21st century.
Akira, you want to add to that? Final words for you?
Well, the problem is, which is what Raymond raised, is that interests drive our planet, and every time interest conflicts with justice and equity, interests trump. They come ahead of the game. And how do we fix that? And can you imagine if tomorrow after a meeting, the DOG of this country comes out a list of names? Here, this guy were bribed, and that. The next time an African leader or minister is taking money, he would say, gosh, if this guy gets caught in his country, my name will come out. There's nothing that beats that in terms of punishment, and that is the biggest thing we have. Why should a country have names? And I have to make a distinction, because Congo is starting, DRC is starting. Why DRC? Because they had a change of leadership in 2018. But the other 4 or 5 countries, the guys who were there are those who were involved. So it's an enigma. How can the fish fry themselves? It won't happen. It won't happen. So if you don't solve that problem, it is for these countries that are forever giving us lessons to say, well, listen, we would not do business with Mr. A, Mr. B, Mr. C, and let everybody know it. And that, I think, is a practical way of stopping impunity.
Cecilia, you have another challenging question. If you can break it down in a short answer and a very inspiring global statement as well at the same time.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. I'll try to answer that shortly, just to say that, you know, beneficial ownership and transparency is as equally important as challenging for shipping as it is for many other industries. And I do think that some of the legislative change push we're now seeing because of the sanctions on Russia and how things are moving, there will also be more transparency on ownerships also for shipping. And I think there are actually some really good examples on how we have moved in that direction. So I do think that that's something on the IMO specifically, which is the UN body for regulating shipping. We pushed about 3 years ago really to say that anti-corruption hasn't actually been addressed very much on the IMO level, and now we're sitting at least with an IMO guideline that also reflects what member states and industry bodies should do to tackle corruption. So I think we are moving in different through different channels to really push the agenda for shipping as well. So thank you so much for that. On the perspectives of giving some crisp, encouraging message in the hours we have now, I think that I'm still very much about the passion for collective action. I think you have to dare bringing private sector to the table, government to the table, really to discuss, be extremely concrete on what we want to achieve. I think incentives is really important. I think we all have everybody who's sitting, if you're working in a country or if you're working international, to really think through what makes this specific stakeholder come to the table. How do we make it beneficial also for the people who needs to go and actually change some practices? Because even in a corrupt government or in a corrupt corporate world, someone actually has to take a flag and make the changes. And you have to build incentives for the people who are actually supposed to do that. So I think it's extremely important that we build anti-corruption measures around incentives. And last but not least, I do think we have to be extremely concrete on the results we want to have. I think for a very long time it's been about policy, it's about hand-holding exercises, and I think that similar as you would set up a performance structure in a company, we have to be much more thorough on what we want anti-corruption measures to deliver on, right? We have to give governments accountability for what are the measures we're setting up. We have to give people in corporations accountability for what is success going to look like in terms of tackling corruption. And I think that's the key message for us, is to build incentives, find collective action, and be extremely concrete on the results we want to have. Otherwise, we won't be successful.
An extremely good point. Paul, Anastasia, how do you reach more people through your work? How do we get there?
I think actually Frederick mentioned exactly what I was going to say, that, in my journalism, it has always been about people and about putting a human face in a story, whatever that story is. And I do recognize how difficult that can be when we're talking about corruption or oligarchs or criminal networks. But I still think it's important to keep trying, because in my opinion, that's the only way why anyone should care about anything. It's about the people at the end of the day. It's about our lives and our emotions. And I know that probably sounds very idealistic and naive, but I genuinely think we need more of that in order to do good work, because all of these discussions can so often be so abstract. But at the end of the day, just a few weeks ago, in the podcast that I'm co-hosting for the Kyiv Independent, we were doing an episode on the oligarchy, both in Russia and Ukraine globally, and how the war affects it. And we always do this in each of the episodes. The first little interview for the few minutes is an interview with a human being who's actually impacted by this global issue we're discussing. It can be anybody, it doesn't need to be an expert. And we decided to pay tribute to Roman Ratushny, who is a now hugely famous globally Ukrainian activist who was killed by Russians while being in the army. He's roughly my age, I'm 21, and he was, I think, 22 or 23. He spent his youth fighting against an oligarchic class in Ukraine. And I think that it's those stories, it's the people of my generation who could do anything else, but they choose to fight corruption and big old evil guys who steal money from us, right? Like my generation chooses to go after these people and raise these issues, and then, you know, sometimes they end up being killed, not necessarily for that investigative reporting in this sense, but nevertheless, we all know the realities of being an investigative journalist. It's not exactly the safest job in the world. So I really think the human stories are so important, because at the end of all of these discussions and at the end of all of these various reporting projects, it all comes down to who ends up being extremely poor and struggles to survive because of this activity, and who loses their home, their family because of this corruption. It is all about people at the end of the day.
Thank you.
Well, I believe all of us in this room, we are trying hard, but we're just building the blueprints for the fight against corruption and organized crime. We are building a Rosetta Stone to actually decrypt what's going on out there. And this is why our audiences are limited. We are too few. Even with books, even with all our investigative articles, we still won't be able to reach, you know, really, really wide audiences. So the future is not in this room, it's out there. But it's based on the work done in this room, because key to having more audience is to engage the public in the work you do. That's a hard task, but that's something that we need to acknowledge, because it's the only way to really make a real dent into corruption and organized crime.
Thank you. I think this is a fantastic concluding point, because it's also, it gives us some hope, because I think the work that everyone in this room, everyone at this conference, everyone around the world is doing is getting so good. I mean, we are maturing as a community, we're maturing as a real community, no longer multiple stakeholders kind of occasionally brought together. We are a real community, and we will get out there, and I think this is an optimistic final thought. I think, however, time is money, you said, for the shipping industry. In the fight against corruption, time is not money, time is life. If we go slow in the fight against corruption, it will continue to cost lives directly and indirectly. We got to go fast. We got to get out there to the people and convince them that they got to take our side. And those who don't want to be on our side, well, we got to expose them, because they have to be outcasts, and they have to be known for being outcasts and not being on the side of the people and of life, of prosperity and peace. So let's go out there and talk to the people and bring that message out there. Thank you so much to my amazing panel. Thank you.
Thank you to our moderator, Gretta, and to our brilliant speakers. That's it for today's plenaries, but we still do have a number of workshops. And of course, the Film for Transparency Festival is still running. There are 2 documentaries being screened this evening. Please visit iaccseries.org for the full schedule. Before we go, a reminder that it is advisable to wear a mask. Let's be mindful of keeping ourselves and those around us in good health, especially in this cold weather. Thank you, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.